the direction we are saying on how can we make a smaller economy work and create well-being for all of us. So there is a lot of thinking, also technological innovation to be had precisely in this direction. The second point I want to say is that by liberating time, it is possible that a lot of innovation will come from there, no? From the cultural pursuits of people in their free time, because people say that idleness rather than necessity is the source of innovation and creativity. It's not people who are hungry trying to survive, the ones that make new technologies. People that they were well fed, they have some free time, they discuss, they interact, and then they come up with new ideas. So I do not see necessarily a contradiction there. Now, there is the case which has been made by a French theorist in the 60s called Jacques Ellul. He wrote about the technological system, and he said, he criticized the way the technology has evolved in our societies into a centralized system that tries to produce a particular type of novelty for novelty's sake, without being in correspondence to particular social needs. And he said that this system is the one which creates growth and material through growth. It has escaped the control of society. That's a controversial thesis, but it's an interesting thesis that back in the 60s and 70s created a lot of turmoil and discussion.
What was his name?
Yeah.
Jacques Ellul. Ellul is E-L-L-U-L. The technological system was called his major work in the 60s. I do not particularly share all his criticism, but I think he's having a point there, that we have to rethink how the technological system works if we want also to direct it to other directions.
I just have a clarifying question that also came up kind of through our discussions. So when you're talking about degrowing the material throughput of the economy, I understand that as kind of both the kind of resources that are used and also, I don't know, the waste that's produced. But what about the kind of the volume of exchanges? So we were just talking about kind of like the Craigslist economy, right? And so in a world, I mean, you can have a lot of economic activity that's generating income and that's circulating money without actually adding to the kind of materials that are used in the waste that's produced if it's a kind of Craigslist economy. And so how does reduction in throughput necessarily imply reduction in income and kind of gross economic activity when you include exchanges? Or just if you can like parse that apart for us a little bit.
Yes, we are advocating the Craigslist economy. So an economy of sharing and exchange, no, that is taking
But that
place
is economic activity in a sense.
It is economic activity.
It's
so
transactions and
there is the
exchanges,
debate.
yeah.
So even Serge Latouste, who is the main proponent of degrowth, he says, I'm agnostic about what will happen to GDP. It might be that through this sharing and exchange economy, GDP increases. I'm skeptical of this argument. And Herman Daly has just published an article in the latest issue of Ecological Economics where he makes exactly this point. He's saying that GDP counts more, I mean, the things it counts, the things that matter in GDP are mostly material throughput related, energy related things. So my speculation here is that a Craigslist economy will produce well-being, will be good for us, but it will not register as GDP growth. So I cannot prove it yet, but that's let's say my strong intuition.
So then there's one thing that I find that growth and degrowth have in common, which is aggregation. In some sense, they're both put in a language of aggregation. We're talking about aggregate quantities. So I would argue in favor of de-aggregation. If we go back into like the baby analogy, babies in the beginning, they have a period of development in which there's little growth, and that's where many of the organs, start being formed. Eventually, there is a period of physical growth, okay? And then once you, let's say, hit 25, you stop developing from the physical point of view, but not from the mental point of view. So in some sense, if you start looking at this development in a more disaggregate way, you definitely would see that the development is shifting. In some cases, in the beginning, it's expressed in physical terms. In other cases, it's expressed in cognitive capacities, in knowledge, in culture, in these other things. So then also when we think about GDP, the fact that an aggregate measure of GDP is biased is biased in favor of material objects, and then when you have a Craigslist economy, you are having economic exchanges that are not registered as GDP. If the economy would shift to that, it's not that basically GDP is not growing, it's that we're worse and worse at counting it, because in some sense you could say that those type of activities, the edits in the Wikipedia, if you would consider that they occur at minimum wage, they also would be contributing. So what I do, tend to think a lot about is actually thinking about the world in less aggregate terms. And I find myself that when I think about the world in less aggregate terms, there's a lot of the tension that I see that happens in the conversation that I'm being introduced to, which are not necessarily there once you start disaggregating and trying to avoid the temptation to reduce things to a single, measure.
I fully agree with that. That's a great point, and I endorse it 100%. The problem, though, and this is the discussion also I had with Van den Berg, is that yes, GDP is increasingly measuring the wrong things, but there is a reason why we are still tailored around measuring GDP. It's not just a mistake, let's say, or a silly obsession of economists. I think it is because it's still what GDP measures matters for the time of economy we're having right now. So when GDP falls, this means that there is a problem for the economy, no matter whatever GDP is measuring. So I think that the transition away from measuring GDP would have to come together with a transition of institutions and the way the economy works. Because in the current economy and institutions we're having, a decline of GDP does mean recession, crisis, and all the bad things we're having right now. So unless we have, for example, also institutions to create employment without GDP growth as measure, we are having a problem. It's not just a matter of measurement.
And I would agree with that, because in some sense you can consider that GDP is also a measure of inclusion, in a way that by mathematical identity GDP is equal to the wages paid. So what I do see as one problem of our modern economy sometimes is that inclusion is more difficult. So there's a lot of people participating in online activities more or less in a voluntary way, but it's hard for them to take their volunteer time on, whether it is Craigslist, Facebook, or Wikipedia, or by making creative funny videos in YouTube, and use that in the supermarket to buy a fruit, And so there is this aspect of inclusion that I think that GDP kind of like measures well, which is this ability of basically incorporating people into the consumption units that are available, and that's why I would say that correlation exists, not necessarily because it is a measure of size that we would care about, but it is and I would say also a bad measure of inclusion, because the inequality definitely it's an orthogonal component that we will need to consider.
Can someone else facilitate?
Yeah, no, Colin, do you want
to? I was wondering, it's not directly addressing that question, but there's one thing that in the end, if we degrow and we have this shrunken economy, sort of, one thing that was bothering me as I was reading through this was, from any kind of either mathematical maximization, general equilibrium model, or any kind of intuitive, people like to consume, firms like to make more, governments like to appease people and firms, I can't imagine a steady state in which we have a sustainable shrunken economy without either totalitarianism, which I know your environmental economist friend mentioned, or using not quite solely, but primarily the method of price controls and taxation, which might help Jevons paradox, might help this investment saving identity as well. But you seem to be a little bit down on the taxation as the primary method, for example, and I'm assuming you're not advocating for a command and control authoritarian society. So are there models, or can you explain the intuition behind how we could possibly get to a shrunken economy, but furthermore, how we could possibly keep at a shrunken economy given the incentives of every player in the market?
Yeah, I'm not against taxation. What I said is that there is a good reason why we talk about taxation for 30 years and nothing has happened in that front. So the idea of taxing the environment is not new at all. I mean, it's an idea that has been there. It doesn't happen because it will harm GDP growth, whatever GDP is counting. So, for example, why don't we tax oil? If we tax oil, which is the main proposal, it's very likely, and I accept that, it's very likely that it will harm the economy. That's why also politicians are not doing it. So what I was saying to Van den Berg is that unless we put these ideas forward and think carefully of what sort of economy, society we create, and that people are motivated to see this happening, unless we do that, it's impossible that environmental taxes will ever be implemented. If the idea is that we will tax the environment and at the same time keep growing, I think we are selling the wrong message. This won't work. That was my impression. Now, how could this happen? That's exactly what we're trying to research. So I wish I could have a response. The basic idea is through a combination of different institutions. Some of this we look in the latest article we published called The Economics of Degrowth. A combination of limitations to resources, caps on certain important resources, liberation of time through reduced working week or work sharing, with all the caveats that we have in mind, and some enforcement of the basic social security at the bottom, so that people do not fall out of the net. So a combination of these three institutions tailored in different ways. But I don't put my word on that. It's like what we are trying to work with these ideas.
But it would be government-style mandates.
It would be government as it is right now, nothing more than that. But the idea is that we have to open the debate so that these ideas are demanded by people, because right now are demanded only by a small minority of people around this table. We might not agree in everything, but we agree. But we might need to discuss something like that.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned the work of Robert Ayers, who's an energy economist. He's actually the smartest person I've ever met in my life. And he wrote, before we've had an economic meltdown, he wrote an article called The End of Exponential Growth, in which he says, look, what was responsible for the growth we don't have anymore. He points out, for example, the entrance of women into the workforce, where you monetize their labor. They're now earning a salary, they now pay a nanny, right? And so GDP really grows because the work is monetized. And this has tremendous implications for the barter economy. I mean, even in Greece now, there's an awful lot of the barter economy. People don't have euros, so they barter their services. And there's a lot of talk in those countries that are suffering that kind of thing of having a dual currency. One, that the wages get paid in that drachma, and food is bought in that drachma, and it has nothing to do with importing refrigerators from Germany or cars or anything else. That the return, I think all this points to something which is fundamentally politically. Who is it that promotes the growth of GDP as it is? And it is people who've been taking an enormous amount of materials, an enormous amount of energy, a small amount of labor to create purchasing power, and turning this throughput society, as Daly calls it. I mean, what a crazy system, right? That you're using this in order to just basically provide a small amount of purchasing power. And the time for purchasing power based on material and energy use is over. The planet makes it over. Either that or we enjoy a 6-degree rise. But I mean, I think this thing becomes basically political. It's not just that we're addicted to GDP. It's that the major political actors that have control of the government only want to promote the growth of GDP in one way.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to ask about your thoughts on a sort of, I feel like a lot of discussions on the sort of next 100 years timescale. Thinking even further ahead, and this is going to sound sci-fi-ish, but it's not as crazy as it might sound. On the 100 to 1,000 year timescale, like long-term future of humanity, you just said that the planet is a limiting factor, and I would argue that it's not necessarily. We have definitely not reached the limits of our ability to generate energy from less resources by any means, and the ability to expand off the limited resources on Earth is certainly not sci-fi at all. There are multiple companies that are exploring use of resources from asteroids and things. Now, these are all, the specifics aren't important, but given that it sort of comes down to the nature of what is human nature. If human nature is to expand and consume, which has all of human evolution to sort of validate that that might indeed be the case, are we talking about are we talking about a battle between changing human nature and the course that humanity has been on versus possibly humanity's ability to keep on maintaining what it's doing? Like, we still take the assumption is that we have one Earth and we keep it as it is now by modifying our worse tendencies, and hopefully everyone can agree that this is the standard of living we're willing to accept. But I would argue that's just fundamentally against any organism's sort of natural desire to expand and consume any niche it can find. And given that we can consume more resources than we currently do through technological progress, this is ultimately like a losing battle, because as long as it's possible for us to consume a bit more, and it certainly is, and you can demonstrate that empirically, we might be able to agree on like pricing externalities, and we have sort of on this 10 to 100 year timescale things you must do to sort of get to there. I mean, that's, everyone knows that, but long term, I'm not sure that this idea of a zero growth economy is natural, and it's just against human nature, and we can indeed grow exponentially, because it's just a matter of not killing ourselves first, but which is quite possible. But that aside, yeah. So, I mean, how do you feel about it? Do you feel like zero growth or degrowth is a natural goal, or I mean, I feel like my argument is that it's not. It's contrary to the natural inclination of life.
Okay. There are many things back there, so it's not one. So if I can try to unpack them. So the first one is if there are natural limits to growth, and this is a huge discussion, which I think there are different views there on whether we are limited by our energy supplies, whether we are thermodynamically limited or not. What I want to say there, it's very difficult to know. There is probably enough energy going around. The problem is whether we can bet that in the future we will be able to continue getting from the energy that exists the energy surpluses that we have managed up to now. What do I mean by energy surplus? I mean net energy. When you take energy out of the earth, you put energy to take this energy out, no? You expend energy. Charles Hall is a biophysical economist who has tried to do some calculations, and he says, back in the beginning of the 20th century, out of each unit of energy we were putting in the ground to take petroleum out, we were taking 50 units of petroleum out. Now we have reached the point that it's 10, 5, it's getting less and less the energy that we take out of Earth. So this might mean that even if we have enough energy for the foreseeable future, we might need to spend more energy to get it out. So less net energy available for us to go by. But this is questionable. Some people are saying it's not like that. Technology will let us go again back to a situation where we draw more. Now the question is, maybe we manage to draw more energy. The problem is that the planet is a closed system, and the energy that we use creates wastes. If we talk about radioactive energy, for example, we have the waste to bury for centuries and centuries. If we talk about fossil fuels, we have the problem of climate change, which will not be solved by finding energy from asteroids, as long as this energy we consume it here on planet Earth. Of course, there is the sci-fi scenario of immigrating to other planets. Would this be possible? Is this the way to bet right now? I mean, I guess there you take a risk. You say, I would bet that within 50 or 100 years we can immigrate elsewhere and burn Earth, or we stay here and we try to manage things better. I think generally I find it a more appealing vision to say we try to manage our home better rather than burn it and escape. I'm kidding. I would
not argue that it's unappealing to manage what we have now, but it's not. I don't think we can like fully put the brakes and like slow down and stop. I think
that's your second point. That's your second point, which is well taken. I discussed it a little bit towards the end of the paper. I don't know if this was clear. So the discussion that it's in the human nature to consume more and more. So I have colleagues who are biologists who often make this statement. They say once a particular group of whatever species finds a resource, it will consume it till the end and collapse. I'm not a biologist, so I don't know how true is that or whether there are exceptions to this rule. What I can say is that within human societies, there have been exceptions to that. So our industrial society is the only society that has continuously grown for 150 years. We have had civilizations like the Greek or the Roman that didn't expand its material throughput over time, and in the Greek society, for example, produced an interesting civilization which was not a continuously growing civilization. This idea of continuously growing the material throughput is relatively new. More importantly, in many old civilizations or communities, you find mechanisms that societies develop, the signals perhaps, the biological signals that you were talking about, precisely to reduce these behaviors that they know that they can be self-destructive. So a lot of the institutions, even religious institutions, religion for many years and for many civilizations were making certain things taboo. Why were these things taboo? Because the society had self-organizedly and automatically understood that these particular practices were self-destructive in the long term, profitable and perhaps appealing to each individual in the short term, but self-destructive for the totality in the long term. So there were institutions to control these practices. So I wouldn't agree that it's a natural tendency to continuously expand. I think it's an internal problem for human groups precisely to manage this expansion that can be self-destructive at the end.
Actually, the period of great growth is a very short period in humankind. If you look at the growth, the wealth over 2,000 years, it stayed constant. Society did not grow. Growth is the aberration. Growth is not the usual.
So I'd like to think a little bit more short-term and pragmatically. What are sort of some of the key institutional lock-ins that we kind of have to overcome? Like a lot of our sort of government and the way society is organized is predicated on growth. Like the way the government's funding itself for, let's say, the next 30 years is kind of predicated somewhat on growth. So can you speak to some of these real key issues and how we would deal with those? Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems is the one that Nicholas has been working on, which is employment. So one of the main of the main problems and challenges, and there is a very nice book also by Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth. I don't know if you've come across it. It raises also the same issue. It says degrowth is unstable because it creates unemployment, and because with continuous productivity improvements, unless you have growth, you have unemployment. So I think one of the big puzzles is what sort of institutions can we develop that will maintain employment in a society without growth. The second key lock-in that I find is the way the financial banking system is working with interest rates, which means that you always have to repay what you get back. There is a built-in assumption that you have to have a certain growth of rate, whatever money or investments you're making in the future. Again, I see this as in clash with an idea of an economy that might not be growing. Again, a source of instability and a source of push to politicians to create growth to avoid, for example, creation of debt, accumulated debt. And the third one, I think, is security and poverty. I mean, social security and poverty. That when more and more of our basic social security systems are funded by this GDP economy, what do we do when we don't have the GDP economy funded? How do we not let people fall off the safety net once the economy stops growing? Again, I think this is possible with distribution. It's not a problem. Another great book to read there, it's from the 70s, is The Social Limits to Growth by Frederick Hirsch, an economist. Great read to explain how a redistribution and more equality could reduce this quest for continuous growth.
All right, so it is 1:30, which is the end of our formal time. If you have to go, thanks so much for coming. We have the room for a little while longer, so we can continue talking for a little bit. Thanks, everyone.